What's up, dudes? Welcome back to another video of Tristiano stuff. Happy Freedom Day to my American homies, fellows, friends, whatever. And to the ones that are not American, you're probably also an independent nation. Well, everybody lives in an independent nation, but maybe you're part of a nation that's not independent, who yearns for freedom, and I hope one day you can get it. I guess. But, yeah, happy Freedom Day to good old Americans. I've got the USA plastic chain to represent. Big freedom guy. So, love that declaration. It's a good declaration. Constitution was decent. Articles of Confederation had their issues, but I honestly kind of prefer them. I'm not here to talk politics. I'm here to spin the globe, which I understand is a pretty popular series. But yeah, here we are. There's our globe. So we're gonna spin it. But I thought, one time, I believe it was a Friends video, I was like, we need to change the tilt of the globe so that I can get a country that I know something about, make it more interesting. But that's another variable. This globe, as we see here, it spins like this, and then it can spin like this, and so I could hit a place. Now, if it's basically like that, right, where I'm gonna hit Antarctica regardless, or I'm gonna hit, well, there's actually a few more options in the Arctic, but still not very many, then I'm gonna redo it. I'm gonna do it so I get maybe something like this, because now I could hit a whole lot of people, really. So yeah, that's how we're doing this. Hopefully you enjoy. Let's set up the camera in a pretty good position, like that. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Okay, we'll do that. We'll spin. I'm gonna go here. Eyes closed. And let the squeaking stop. I know it has stopped. Oh, wow. That's hilarious. On Freedom Day, I hit San Francisco. You can see here. I moved my finger up off of it, but that's where I was at. Or maybe more like there. But that's San Francisco. I hit in California. So today we will be talking about the good old United States on Freedom Day. I feel like this is very fitting. So yeah, when I started this, very late on Freedom Day. July 4th, Independence Day, as some may know it as. Or the 4th of July, right? But by the time this video is over, it will most certainly be July 5th. Because I have a lot to say about the United States. Too much. And I said this is not supposed to be political. It's going to be very political, because I'm talking about the United States, the country I'm from, and I'm a politics nerd. So, of course, I'm going to talk about my own country's politics. I'm not going to make opinions too clear. I'll talk about certain controversies, voice my opinions on maybe some of the earlier political issues of the United States, simply because nowadays it's less revealing of, things. I'm not trying to get controversial on Tristiano stuff. If I want to get controversial, I'll do that somewhere else. But yes, we shall now talk about Estados Unidos, the United States. So, U.S. history. See, if you take AP U.S. history, which I did, they begin. Technically, there's Unit 0, which is pre-Columbian, 1491 is the year that it is, and it's anything before that as well technically counts. And it focuses on the European factors that led to the eventual colonization or exploration, and also Native American societies prior to that. So the history of the United States begins long time ago. Native American prehistory, you have people like the Mississippi Hill people. Yeah, those guys. The one, like the Coquia Mountains is an example of this culture's construction. You have the Pueblos of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, that region, and there's still a large Native American presence in those states. You've got tribes in the Northwest, notorious for totem poles. There are California tribes, and I believe this is true, but I can't confirm. A lot of the California tribes happen to have much more linguistic diversity than other tribes. And I remember hearing a story about how there was this last speaker of this one native tribal language in California. And I really don't remember anything else about the story, but the language started with a Y. I know that. You have Inuits and Aleuts up in Alaska, or Aleuts, I don't know how it's pronounced. And then I'm a Texan, so you've got the Karankawa, Caddo, Apache in the Plains region, or Caddo maybe. So you got, those are the prominent tribes of Texas. Comanche also. Comanche, Karankawa, and Caddo, or Caddo. And yeah, they've got a lot of tribes. In fact, there's a city in Mississippi called Natchez, and that's named after a Native American tribe, the Natchez tribe. Obviously, you have the Powhatans of the eastern seaboard. I believe that was the Pilgrims, although no, that's not correct. The Powhatan League, which we'll talk about probably in a moment, was a Virginia thing, or in the region of now Virginia, right? Then you have, I mean, there's so much. Certain trends that you kind of noticed amongst Native American tribes. Agriculture was developed in a lot of different areas, but one area where it was where it was less utilized was the plains. And once Native Americans started to get pushed out into the plains, you started to see them use agriculture less and less. Even if they were traditionally agricultural tribes, agriculture became less prominent in their lives, essentially. But there's pre-Columbian United States. The first permanent settlement in the United States is St. Augustine in Florida. And then the first English permanent settlement was Jamestown in 1607. And so with Jamestown, you initially didn't see a whole lot of economic successes. However, once tobacco became utilized, the colony began booming agriculturally and economically, just generally, as it was a very useful cash crop. Other early colonies, obviously, we have the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, and slightly later on, the Massachusetts Bay colony, which includes many other Puritan settlements. But this is primarily Puritans and Pilgrims. The Pilgrims being a slightly different group than Puritans, obviously generally having, or not obviously, but generally having similar beliefs. However, the Puritans believed that they should purify the Anglican Church, whereas Pilgrims just wanted to separate. And so there's that. Then, once we get, also somewhat early on, well, not really, but towards the 1680s, then you start to see a lot more colonies. And the middle colonies are my personal favorite based on what was available and diversity, whatever it may be. Most notably is Pennsylvania, which was a primarily Quaker colony. So as we see, a lot of religious freedom was kind of given in the colonies, or it was a reason for settlement for a lot of the colonies. But these Quakers, they also had pretty lax rules. If you believed in Christ, you were chill. Any Christian. And so Pennsylvania had pretty liberal laws, and as a result, a more diverse population. It was also known as the breadbasket of the colonies because, well, it made a lot of the food crops in the region. You know, the South was more known for cash crops, although that did include rice in places like South Carolina, which were the first to utilize heavy amounts of chattel slavery. But the utilization of cash crops in the South meant that less food was produced. In the Northeast, or the northern colonies, you did not see very many much food production because of the soil conditions. Now, subsistence agriculture, as in, I'll make some food for my family and maybe sell just a little bit. But, like, this is not my job, like, I make a boat, or I make alcohol, or whatever, or I trade, but I don't farm, That's different in middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania, and that's very different from the southern colonies, where the almost the only economic activity was farming. And so, yeah, middle colonies, very diverse. You got a lot of Dutch immigrants, German immigrants as well were quite common. And due to that religious freedom element, you had a lot of Anabaptists and similar groups form or move here as well, escaping persecution in Europe. And we now know of these people as the Amish, although other sects also existed amongst Anabaptists moving to the region. But yeah, that's kind of the colonies early on, just kind of the info about them. New York was originally settled by the Dutch, and that's why you saw a lot of people who were Dutch move there. In fact, the 7th president of the United States, Martin Van Buren, no, that's not correct, the 8th president of the United States, if I'm not mistaken, Martin Van Buren, yeah, it's the 8th, was the first president born in the United States when it was independent, that is. And another fun fact about Mr. Van Buren, he was born in Kinderhook, New York, and he is a Dutch man. He's the only president in U.S. history with no English descent. He spoke Dutch, yada, yada, yada. Martin Van Buren, very Dutch. Now, moving on, we get to kind of the mid-1700s. Chattel slavery is well established in the South, and some amount of slavery was definitely prevalent, I guess, or prominent in the North. However, certain states had began to outlaw it, or what would become states, but colonies, because of its relative rarity and because of solitary neglect. They were able to just say, hey, you can't do that anymore, pretty much. And the British government did not care. However, after the French and Indian War, part of the broader 7 Years' War, despite the fact that the French and Indian War was 9 years long, which began in 54 and ended in 63 of the 1700s, right? After that, the U.S. government, or not the U.S. government, but the British government was in a lot of debt. And to pay off these debts, they're like, hey, we just fought a war in your territory. We are going to tax you now. We're going to tax your tea. We're going to tax your legal documents and whatever paper you have, the Stamp Act, right? We're going to tax all sorts of things. And colonists were not happy. They said, okay, if you're going to tax our tea and our paper, we're going to tar your tax collectors and throw your tea overboard. How's that sound? And they said, I don't like that, so we're just going to close the port of Boston and anger you more. And they're like, yeah, you did well. Very good job angering us. And there's another element. This is how we got our Third Amendment. They would send troops to just live in people's houses, in Boston especially, where the military presence was higher due to the greater degree of tension. And so this is known as quartering, and it's what inspired the Third Amendment. So, Americans were not happy with this. Very much unhappy. And what we did, well, I guess colonists were very unhappy with this. And what many of us did was say, hey, let's fight them. And so we did so with smaller acts of rebellion, which kind of led to the situation in the first place. But we also, eventually we started raiding armories and taking weapons and starting to shoot. And we wrote the Declaration of Independence soon after the first battle at Lexington and Concord, known as the shots heard around the world. But, it was really just, that's where it began. Declaration came later, but it was important. And we saw stuff like Common Sense from Thomas Paine at the same time, where he's like, yeah, why should this island, an ocean away, be telling us how to live and taxing our goods that we are trying to have, you know? So that kind of incited it. After we win the Battle of Saratoga in New York, the French decided to support us, and this is in 1778. And after that, I mean, it's really just victory, victory, victory. I mean, there's obviously points where we didn't win, especially in those first 2 years. But eventually, the Battle of Yorktown, we did seal the deal and win the war. And 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was signed. And boom, that's how the war ended. Now, of course, the early era of American independence was quite tumultuous. Many things had to occur. And so among these things was a change in Constitution. Now, our original Constitution was so anti-British that it basically said that the federal government would have no power. And there's no such thing as executives like the king. We can't take taxes. We can have an army, but we can't take taxes. How are you going to have an army if you can't take taxes? The answer is you really can't. It's quite difficult. And so eventually people are like, hey, I don't like what's happening. And they start to rebel. There's a small rebellion known as Shays' Rebellion, led by a farmer whose last name is Shay, and in Massachusetts. And as a result of Shays' Rebellion, people are like, hey, we probably need to change this document, maybe even make a new one. What do we think? And most people seem to agree, although there was people known as anti-federalists who opposed the Constitution. And one major reason for their opposition was there was no Bill of Rights, no amendments, you know, the 10 amendments that we started off with, and then we added on many more later. There was none of that. And a lot of these people wanted that. You know, they thought, the nice thing about this other thing was we had freedom. This has nothing to do with our freedom. It just says, hey, this is how government works now. And they wanted freedom. And so they eventually got it. The Bill of Rights was added. But part of this debate yielded what is known as the Federalist Papers, where Hamilton, Jay, as in John Jay, and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, right, John Jay and James Madison wrote the, papers or documents. John Jay only wrote 5, Hamilton wrote like 51, I don't remember the number that Madison wrote, it's 20. If you want to figure out the numbers, the musical Hamilton has the numbers. Now, and it's correct, but it has the numbers, it's important to note. But after that, we got a constitution, which was signed in 1787, or at least the Constitutional Convention began in 1787. And then soon afterwards, we had the presidential election of 1788, which was obviously won by George Washington, as he was like the only person that people really considered. John Adams became his vice president, as he was like the number 2 candidate. Now his cabinet was kind of a mixed bag. Thomas Jefferson was obviously in it as the Secretary of State. Both Virginians who were probably pretty close, from what I know. And, I mean, Jefferson was just so prominent. Plus, Washington was opposed to factionalism, so a multi-partisan cabinet looked good for that, I guess, goal. But the rest of his cabinet was primarily Federalists, and we'll get to the political parties right now. So there was the Democrat-Republicans, led by Jefferson and his right-hand man, I guess, Madison. And then there was the Federalists, led by Adams, with another faction, and I would not say his right-hand man, but with another faction kind of led by Alexander Hamilton, known as the High Federalists, who at times proposed having a king for the country. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury at the very beginning of our country, and his financial plans were very controversial, leading to another rebellion known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, since we had the Constitution, the federal government had more power. It was able to build a force to fight the Whiskey Rebellion, and it was much shorter, simpler, easier, yada, yada, yada. Now, if we move past that, Adams had a garbage administration. XYZ affair almost led to war with France, and the Alien and Sedition Acts just angered everybody, especially the Democrat Republicans, who would go on to win with Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800 after he lost to Adams in 1796. So the election of 1800, now we had Thomas Jefferson, and while he claimed to put in radical reforms, the reforms weren't too radical, really. He's perhaps negatively viewed for his tariff of 1807, which brought us very close to war with both France and Britain, particularly Britain, and hurt domestic economy. However, from Jefferson's perspective, he was like, I don't care, if I'm planting, I'm planting, so we're chilling. But the Northerners, who were much more manufacturing-based and trade-based, definitely did not like that, and their economies really didn't like that. And then he's well known for the Louisiana Purchase, which has just doubled the size of the country at the time. I think that one of his worst policies was probably his trade policy regarding Haiti. He, like many European powers, just said, nope, we're not trading with those guys. They were a slave rebellion. Obviously, it wouldn't look good for him, given he had 600 slaves at his peak, and probably had 6 children with one of his slaves. It's believed that these 6 children were with this particular woman who was a slave of his, but not necessarily confirmed. I mean, there's some evidence, but I don't know how compelling you can really say it is. I definitely lean more towards they are his children, and that's pretty bad, for sure, but I mean, there are still definitely valid arguments or convincing arguments to say that they aren't his children. Beyond that, though, next president was James Madison, who was basically the protege of Jefferson, a very young dude, and very important in U.S. politics. He, in fact, is the author of the Constitution, where Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Wouldn't be surprised if he did write the Constitution, but he was in the United States. He was in France, being diplomatic and stuff, as he was very much pro-France. After him was Monroe, who was famous for the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said, hey, Europe, this right here, it's mine. That right there, it's yours. Have at it. Have fun. Live your life. But this is mine was referring to the United States, or not the United States, but the Americas in general, whereas that's yours was basically everything else. Except for Liberia, which the United States decided to eventually form anyways. Like, hey, we really just meant that this is ours, but that could be ours, but it also could be yours. You can do whatever you want to do. So yeah, that's what happened with the U.S. under Monroe, the formation of the Monroe Doctrine. Although the Monroe Doctrine was really John Quincy Adams' idea, and he became the next president. However, as president, he did virtually nothing. The way in which he became president was relatively controversial, as it involved a corrupt bargain with the leader of the House, or the Speaker, I guess. And this angered the next president, Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was radically different from most of the presidents that we had had. His favorite was probably Thomas Jefferson, due to just generally more populist ideals, but he took it to a new level. He's most negatively viewed for his treatment of Native Americans. He began the Trail of Tears, essentially. However, if we want to look at the positives, he was certainly more dedicated to the people, I guess. And a lot of his policies were generally small government, meaning that the people were able to kind of freely live their lives, which is what this country was founded on. Remember, this is Independence Day, or it was about 10 minutes ago. It became July 5th, but he kind of lived by that, unless you were a Native American, in which case you get no freedom. You have to move to Oklahoma. Now, beyond that, there's certainly more. His protege, and this isn't completely true, as the man tried to shape Jackson, was Martin Van Buren, and he's, once again, Dutch, from Kinderhook, New York. All sorts of fun stuff. The only president with no English descent. Pretty neat. After that, you get mostly irrelevant dudes. I'm pretty sure next is William Henry Harrison, who died after like a month. And then his vice president, if I'm not mistaken, was John Tyler. And then eventually we get to dudes like Buchanan, or I guess Polk's quite important, as he led us into the Mexican-American War, and was committed to being a one-term president. Now, he was still pretty garbage, I would argue, but his commitment to being a one-term president is kind of admirable. He said, I'm here, I'm going to expand us into some Mexican territory, and that's really it. That's all I want to do. I'll leave after one term. If I failed, I failed. If I didn't fail, then I didn't fail. Kind of a based approach to things. It's like, here, I'm going to do radical reform, and then I'm done. All right? Just the things that he wanted to do, probably not the right things. Or at least, in retrospect, a little wrong and certainly aggressive. But after him, or at least I believe he's the 14th president. I could be wrong. Could be 13. So after him somewhat is Buchanan, who was a Democrat right before the Civil War, and he basically did nothing to ensure that it could have been stopped. Now, the Civil War was kind of inevitable with all of the compromises of the early 1800s, Missouri Compromise being one of them. There's all sorts of compromises. Kansas-Nebraska Act as well. All these acts led to increased violence surrounding the issue of slavery and race. But nothing could have been done completely to prevent the Civil War. However, you can still pin that failure to an extent on Buchanan. But after Buchanan served as president, it was the Republican second election, 1860, and there was a whole lot of opposition. You had a Northern Democrat candidate in Mr. Douglas, Stephen Douglas, the guy who's famous for debating Lincoln and creating Lincoln-Douglas debate, or at least inspiring the style behind Lincoln-Douglas debate, not necessarily creating it. Then you had a Southern Democrat, and then you had the Constitutional Union Party. The Constitutional Union Party won 4 states, kind of in the border region between the eventual Confederate States of America and the remaining members of the Union. Northern Democrats won absolutely no states, if I'm not mistaken. The Southern Democrats won most of the South, or almost all the South. And then you had Lincoln winning almost the entire North. And it showed to Southerners that you could win the entire North and be so radically opposed to Southern ideologies, and you didn't need the South at all. And they said, hey, this guy's going to get rid of our slaves, which wasn't part of his plan, but they thought it was. They're like, or they at least felt as if he was a threat in that regard. They was like, he's going to get rid of our slaves, all right? He's going to do a lot of other things we wouldn't like. Let's secede. They almost seceded, or they almost had a secession crisis in like the 1830s because John C. Calhoun opposed some tariffs, and slavery was a much bigger issue as it actually caused the Civil War. And this initial secession would have probably just been South Carolina, although the South did not like tariffs generally and was a big fan of states' rights. But primary among the states' rights was definitely slavery, and that's something that we saw as a cause for the Civil War. Now, the Civil War lasted 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, and it was won by the Union, the northern states. But it was very bloody, and while the freeing of the slaves was a significantly important event in American history, both the Emancipation Proclamation, which said, if you were a slave in the Confederate area, the second we take it, you're free. All right. And the 13th Amendment, which said, who cares where you're at? You're free, right? All slaves in the United States are free, right? These things were very significant, and you could attribute them to Lincoln, especially the Emancipation Proclamation, which was directly done by Lincoln, whereas the 13th Amendment was just encouraged by Lincoln, but he had no real say in getting implemented. But he was controversial as well, at least at the time, more so than he is now, for some definitely authoritarian tendencies, such as the arrest of, I believe, 14,000, in air quotes, Confederate sympathizers, who really just opposed the war due to things like, I don't know, the amount of bloodshed that was inevitable, and the cost to American life, or innocent life, even in the Confederacy, which, I mean, obviously Lincoln's going to view that as the U.S. still, as American life. Even if they're rebelling Americans, they're Americans. And so that was kind of the debate. It was, well, do we fight these people who are trying to get away from us? Or do we take a peaceful route, understand that these people were part of us just a second ago? Many of them were innocent, and war would be very costly. And Lincoln said, war is going to be costly, sure, but it's a worthy cost to preserve the Union in its current form. And to those who disagreed, many Democrats, of course, who were just generally more favorable to slavery, although Northern Democrats were okay with its outlawing in their states. These people were arrested and, deported, essentially. Some of them, habeas corpus was suspended, etc., etc. So Lincoln, while doing very many important things, such as freeing the slaves, which nobody can deny the importance of, is a little controversial for his authoritarian tendencies. Especially back then, he would have been. Now, after Lincoln is the notoriously awful Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern apologist to the core, and basically prevented as much as he could from the radical Republican agenda. However, the radical Republicans still got a lot done, especially once Johnson was out, with Ulysses S. Grant, although the Grant administration was notoriously corrupt. And after that, we run into a very controversial election, where the Democrat and the Republican were very, very close to tying. And so eventually, the southern states were just like, hey, take your troops out, suspend military rule in the South, and we'll give you the election. You can win it. That's fine. And that's what happened. So we had another Republican president. Then we get to our Gilded Age presidents who didn't do too much, but after the assassination of, if I'm not mistaken, it's Arthur. That could be very much correct, Chester A. Arthur. But after an assassination of one of the Gilded Age presidents, his successor, his vice president, passed legislation requiring civil servants to take an exam to become civil servants, essentially. And, bureaucrats, essentially, right? And this has to do with the fact that the assassin was denied a role that he had initially been promised, essentially, which, would not make many people happy. But he went to the extreme of killing the president over it. Now, coming out of the Gilded Age, we get to William McKinley. And William McKinley ends up being assassinated during his second term by an anarchist and replaced by Theodore Roosevelt, beginning the Progressive Era. Now, Teddy is a big military guy. He's big on kind of imperialist foreign policy. But when it comes to domestic policy, he's a progressive, begins the Progressive Era, very big on conservation, as well as just reforms to improve on social conditions, especially for when it comes to social inequity. Now, the Progressive Era ends kind of with World War I, although Woodrow Wilson is kind of just like a racist progressive. He's still a progressive. He's still putting in a lot of reforms. He's kind of an internationalist, proposing the idea for the League of Nations and going on a barnstorming campaign to get it done, although due to, I believe, strokes, he kind of failed. And I mean, obviously there was opposition that didn't help him, but due to, we're going to say strokes, is the reason that his barnstorming campaign kind of was ineffective. And it never went through for the United States, although many countries did end up joining the League of Nations. And I shouldn't say many, but there were countries that joined the League of Nations, just not the U.S., who created the idea for it. And then we have others. You know, these are not the only peeps to consider. We also, I guess, but yeah, Woodrow Wilson, a racist progressive. One of his more silly decisions that I think people kind of recognize would be the, I guess, screening of Birth of a Nation, really something that's was kind of revolutionary in film, but also something really bad, basically glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and leading to a massive surge in new memberships in this organization, which had kind of died out. So Woodrow Wilson, very bad. He also pushed for an amendment allowing for an income tax, and during World War I, also had some moderate, albeit present, anti-German sentiments. And I think that when we're talking World War I, the Germans were over-vilified and are still over-vilified. World War II, obviously, I think that it was fair vilification. But during World War I, it was overdone, rather. Now, we move to Warren G. Harding, who was like, let's return to normalcy. That was his kind of slogan. He said that World War I was tough, a bunch of crazy stuff happened, Woodrow Wilson is garbage, we don't like Woodrow, we want Woodrow out. And all of this yabba dabba do, right? He said all of these things. And he won on that platform. Now, he was very laissez-faire when it came to economic issues, less regulation, etc., etc. And he gets assassinated. And his administration is relatively controversial, particularly for what is known as the Teapot Dome scandal, where one of his cabinet members, I believe his name was like Albert Fall or something, did some shady oil treaty thing in Wyoming, and that was revealed around the time of Harding's death, but not prior. Now, on top of this, and after Harding dies, it's Calvin Coolidge who takes his place. And Calvin Coolidge is my favorite president. He kind of just sat there. He reduced government spending, reduced taxes, and to an extent attempted to resist the pressure of Congress to pass anti-immigration laws, but then did it anyways. Certainly his worst decision, I think, at least the severity of them for certain, was pretty garbage. You could debate whether or not there needs to be some degree of restriction to immigration. I'm not here to talk about that, but I am here to say that completely banning or establishing such radical quotas that especially favored immigration from Western and Northern European countries and said no to immigration from everywhere else, at least to such a degree, was negative. You can't argue that, or it'd be difficult to argue that. And so that was Coolidge. Now, some people blame him for the Great Depression because his reduction of subsidies harmed agriculture and other stuff, obviously. But I think that this is unfair. And I mean, given the sheer economic growth during Coolidge's administration, perhaps some of the best economic growth in U.S. history, it's kind of a strange thing to argue. Now, Hoover came in, and he's like, yeah, everything's great. We're chilling. And then the Great Depression happened. And he was not expecting it. And he tried somewhat to fix it. Volunteerism was kind of a big deal, which is like, hey, if you volunteer, and it should be up to your own volition to help out. Otherwise, what are you going to do? And so he tried many volunteerist-oriented solutions to the Depression, which eventually didn't get enough done to satisfy many, and he lost he lost profoundly in 1932 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I believe is the second cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, a bunch of times removed. I don't know. They are related, but not super duper closely. Now, FDR kind of birthed the U.S. welfare state, and he had so many programs. I believe that his programs were kind of based on three main principles, the three R's. There was basically relief, maybe restore, reform. All right, and so relief is like just immediate aid to those who are most needy. Then restore is what we're calling it. I don't know if that's the term historians use, but restore is basically let's restore a lot of the institutions in the United States that have proven themselves vital to economic vitality, and then reform, change our systems, and create new ones to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. Or if it does, it'll be less severe and easy to respond to. And that's how we got things like Social Security, and many other things that people would argue are unconstitutional. And he almost court-backed in order to circumvent the control of what was at the time a conservative court. Now, after him, during his term, and what I really believe solved the Depression was the beginning of World War II, as it bolstered our military economy, which is really ironic. The military-industrial complex saved the United States from the Great Depression. Kind of something sad to admit, but the reality nonetheless, at least in my opinion. Now, after this, in our entry into World War II, he runs for a fourth term. He wins a fourth term, and then he dies pretty early on to be replaced by Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman he serves the duration of FDR's term and then wins re-election. And he tries to run again. However, he loses to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Truman did not do too much. However, the Truman Doctrine was basically contain communism, right? Because after World War II, where the focus was on fascism, it was about communism. We need to stop communism, etc., etc., etc. And so they tried to very much. And in some cases were pretty successful. For example, Turkey and Greece had communist revolution threats, basically, that were prevented by Truman aid. And also during Truman was the Marshall Plan, that's right, which was like, hey, let's give a bunch of these countries that just got decimated in a war a whole bunch of money so that they can rebuild infrastructure and not become communist or fascist, right? Pretty wise and pretty effective. Countries that received the most money were France and Germany, and I guess Italy as well did receive some, but obviously it stretched far beyond that. The effects of it did. And so Truman was pretty decent. However, he, I guess, became moderately controversial due to his handling of Korea, if I'm not mistaken, is what caused it. And Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "Hey, yo, I'm going to do things differently." And, I mean, he did things somewhat differently. And he's best known for the interstate highway system. So, if you're driven on I-5, I-10, I-15, I-20, I-25, I-30, I-35, I-40, yada, 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 yada. I don't know how high it goes, but it goes high, right? If you ever driven on these roads, then you're driving on Dwight D. Eisenhower's work, basically. And this was, at the time, the largest infrastructure project in the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, it still is, based on cost and labor and everything. However, it had many negative effects, which I particularly find interesting due to my interest in urban planning and policies relating to it. And so the problem here was that building the highways generally just decimated communities, especially those with higher shares of minorities. Anyways, Eisenhower serves 2 terms, and he gets out of there, because by now we have the amendment saying you can only serve 2 terms. And after Eisenhower comes Kennedy, who after around 1,000 days is assassinated. Fun fact, Kennedy met Bill Clinton, as Bill Clinton went to Boys Nation, after, being selected from Boys State, which is something that I was supposed to do, but I felt really ill, unfortunately. However, Clinton states that Kennedy is his favorite president due to this meeting, and overall a lot of policy reasons as well. But Kennedy's main thing, if I'm not mistaken, was referred to as the New Frontier. And it involved creating things like the Peace Corps and a bit of a focus on foreign policy, as well as certain things like civil rights, although he didn't delve too much into those as he died relatively early. But his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, did finish Kennedy's term and run again, winning. He considered running again, but was told no, basically. He decided not to run due to immense unpopularity due to the Vietnam War, where there was drafting, yada, yada, yada. But he created many things, such as the housing and urban development department, and as well as the secretary position on the cabinet, and then, Voting Rights Act of 64, I believe of 68 as well was one. Many more. Civil rights was big for Lyndon B. Johnson, despite the fact that he's a Southern Democrat Texan, which feels very ironic. And early on in his life, he, if I'm not mistaken, he was actually a supporter of somewhat mild segregation policies. But his presidency reflected a change, I guess. After LBJ, we get Nixon, who kind of was like, hey, I'm going to do things differently with Vietnam. And he technically did. He made it worse, though, especially at least with the Vietnamese. One of his secretaries, the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, is basically a war criminal, and it's awful. He recently died at the age of 100, and it was heavily memed. But yeah, Nixon was not very good. And Watergate only added to the negatives. Gerald Ford is a president who I kind of wish I liked, but I don't. He had the WIN program to try to beat inflation, which was very high, partially due to Nixon taking us off the gold standard, if you ask me. But we were in a state of stagflation, meaning economic growth was not very high, whereas inflation was. Really bad place to be in, because if you want to get yourself out of inflationary status, it tends to hurt GDP growth. And if you want to get yourself into higher GDP growth, it tends to increase inflation. So you have to tackle one issue at a time, and it's difficult. It's really quite difficult. Now, his failure in fighting this issue was not his only issue. At least at the time, the American people were mad at the pardoning of Nixon, who they're like, yeah, this guy's totally a criminal. Watergate was illegal. How could he pardon Nixon? But he did it anyways. And so after finishing Nixon's term, we get another Democrat who was an outsider, because these insiders are pardoning each other and, wiretapping. Like, this is crazy, right? And that outsider was one-term Democrat governor from Georgia, born in a town of 400 people, Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was, once again, he's kind of a president I want to like, but really can't warrant liking. He just failed on a whole lot of levels, especially on foreign policy. He kind of was passive when it came to the invasion of Afghanistan, and the Iran hostage crisis. It took him almost a year to negotiate, and he did negotiate it. But the day that the hostages came back was also the day of Reagan's inauguration. So it's like a kick in the face. It's like, yeah, you did it, sure, Jimmy, but it's the day Reagan got inaugurated, so it looks like you did nothing. And he had domestic failures as well. But one thing that a lot of people credit him for, especially now, which is causing a rise in his popularity, is his commitment to environmental issues, which is hard to disagree with. I mean, Jimmy Carter definitely paid a lot of attention to conservation and other environmental issues, such as, global warming wasn't really so commonly used as a term at the time, but I guess emissions limitations, because clean air and water, are kind of important, although those were Nixon laws. Jimmy Carter definitely added to the strength of environmental protections. Then we moved to Reagan, who kind of birthed the neoliberal movement, or even neoconservative, you would like to say. And while idealized by Republicans now, what people don't understand often is that he's pretty pro-immigrant, which is something that a lot of Republicans now aren't. And he's really like the establishment that the MAGA Republicans claim to hate, but they love Reagan nonetheless. So quite the anomaly now if we look at him. But he was quite the economic libertarian, or at least somewhat, not entirely, as he spent pretty heavily. Government spending was high under Reagan, as he tried to outspend the Soviets, really. But otherwise, deregulating in many regards, and trying to lower taxes, despite the massive expenditure, which put us in a whole lot of debt, was Reagan's mojo. And so Reagan did this, and it definitely had varying results. I would argue that the industrial manufacturing in the United States continued at a relatively high output for another 4 or 5 years because of Reagan, but during Reagan's presidency, there were economic issues. Regardless, he won 2 terms, and the president after him was his vice president, the first Bush, H.W., George Herbert Walker Bush, right? And so H.W. was actually from Maine, if I'm not mistaken, but he's from the Northeast for certain. And he moved to Texas did some Texasing, and actually quite funny, was a bit of a competitor to Reagan. He called his economic plan voodoo economics because, where were the hands guiding the economy, right? The invisible hand of the laissez-faire economy, right? That's kind of what he talked about, although it's really an oversimplification of Reagan's economics. After his one term, Bill Clinton, who met JFK when he was a youngster, was like, hey, dude, I'm president now. And he had relatively similar beliefs to Reagan economically, certainly a little more adamant on regulations. But free trade was a big element of his presidency, as he signed the NAFTA trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, saying, hey, no tariffs. All right, guys? However, he's definitely most remembered, or best remembered for, I guess, best is a silly word because it's a very negative thing in the eyes of many, but he's most notable for his affair with Monica Lewinsky, and claiming that he did not have sexual relations with that woman, when in fact he did. After Clinton, we had George W. Bush, who served 2 terms, writing the popularity of, we were attacked, we need to attack back, but he kind of duped a lot of people, saying this, that, and the other, lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, etc., etc. And there's all sorts of conspiracy theories about what the event that led to the war on terror, 9/11, which is a very sad day in American history, regardless of who caused it. But conspiracy theorists say that it was government action, and that's... And knowing the U.S. government, who knows? Kennedy was almost certainly assassinated by the U.S. government. I'm getting a little too political here, but, it's very possible the U.S. government is far from innocent, but to think that they did that just feels wrong almost. But after him, we had 2-term President Barack Obama, the first black president, and Barack was quite the technocrat, leaving things to bureaucracy, and quite the smooth talker. And then we got Trump, who was like, hey, the system is bad. Now I'm going to do a Trump impression, okay? Ready? The system is bad. We need to build a wall so that we can drain the swamp. The system, so bad. Really, really bad. I'm very good. Vote for me, Donald Trump, for president. That's basically what Trump said. And it helped them win. Although Hillary Clinton being super unpopular also helped them win in 2016. 2020 was a different story. Biden won, although many people claimed that there was cheating, including Trump himself. He said, this election was very fraudulent. There was much fraud. I am not fraudulent. I am very fair, free and fair. This election was not free, nor was it fair. There was so much fraud. We need to stop the fraud. We need to deny the election. And people say that he incited insurrection when he said, protest patriotically at the Capitol. Don't do anything crazy. That's not verbatim what he said, but he said, don't do anything crazy. Don't, raid it or anything, because that would be really bad. But just be good old patriots and whatnot. And then Rudy Giuliani went up on stage, and I don't know how to do a New York accent very well, but he was like, hey, these people in government, they're really bad. You gotta stop them, bro. Stop them from doing this count thing. And that's really what incited it, I'd argue. And there's certainly many constitutional arguments there to whether or not it was insurrection on Trump's part, and whether or not he should be eligible for 2024. But he currently is running. The Supreme Court says he has criminal immunity, and we'll see how the 2024 election goes. But that's really where we are with U.S. history. Now, we landed on California specifically, and then even more specifically San Francisco. So let's talk about California. It's a state It's the most populous state as it stands currently, and we really started to see the boom in population. I mean, there's obviously small booms throughout the 1800s. The mid-1800s, we saw, particularly to the northern region of California, gold caused a boom. San Francisco became a prominent city, and we'll talk more about that. But in the early 1900s, we see California more generally, especially the South, start to see a boom in population as well, due to the rise of new industries, such as the movie industry, with Hollywood. Now, there's this interesting story, and I forget the man's name, but he was a self-taught engineer, didn't go to college, and he's kind of famous for building a dam, or for building dams, but one of the dams he built broke, and it ended up causing like catastrophic drowning events in like Los Angeles, which is very bad. But this is early on in its growth, and there was many issues with water management to handle. Now consider Los Angeles and just Southern California in general having a population above 20 million, and you really start to see issues there. Now, California kept growing and kept growing and kept growing. It is now the largest state, but it is starting to see population decline. The birth rate is lower than the death rate, and immigration into the state is mostly driven by international immigrants, whereas residents of California are leaving more than people are moving in from other U.S. states. And so you saw the first population decline in California in, I believe, its entire history as a state, or at least in a very, very, very long time, as it's basically just grown to its current status. But the current governor is Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, who tried to get high-speed rail in place, but kind of failed, just due to massive overruns in cost. The last Republican governor was actor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who took over after a recall election in the early 2000s. But yeah, I mean, California is a very Democrat state. It is regarded as safe each presidential election. Although the, I guess, fourth most recent Republican president was from California, Ronald Reagan, and he did win his home state in, I believe, both elections. The first election, 1980, was an extreme landslide. And so, Reagan was just, I mean, it was after Reagan, really, that you start to see the trend of California going blue. But it's now very much blue. San Francisco, we'll talk about that more specifically. It was a very small fishing town, population of maybe 4,000 prior to the gold rush. And then people were like, hey, even if I'm not mining gold or whatever it is I do for gold, I can like set up a store here. Maybe I can sell them food or sell them equipment. All sorts of things. I'm going to make money. And so, while many people made money off the gold rush, many didn't. And some people made money off the gold rush by not mining gold, but supplying the miners. In a large immigrant community at the time that's important to San Francisco, both now and was at the time, too, is the Chinese immigrant community. Chinese immigrants to San Francisco came for various reasons. The gold rush was definitely one of them. However, they're pretty well known for building the Transcontinental Railroad, in large part, at least from the West. And they had one of the very first Chinatowns in the United States. San Francisco now has many issues. Homelessness is extremely high in San Francisco. The cost of living is extremely high in San Francisco. But the San Francisco area, more broadly, has certain promising things like Silicon Valley, which is the center of all tech innovation in the United States, and a lot of it globally. I shouldn't say all tech innovation. There's obviously innovation happening elsewhere, and many companies have moved out of this region just due to the costs of operating there. But still, Silicon Valley has an influential role in the U.S. economy and even global economy. But yeah, I mean, there's your synopsis. I basically just explained the entirety of U.S. history to you and then told you a few things about California. If I went in more depth, I'd be angering half of the internet, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you for watching. I don't know if I did. What's up, dudes? Welcome back to another video of Tristan on Stuff. So I'm going to do my intro at the very end of the video. What's up, dudes? Welcome back to another video of Tristan on Stuff. Happy Freedom Day is what I did say, but I don't think I did the intro. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this very, very long video. But yeah.